The minutes stretched longer than they should have, not because the restaurant was busy, but because no one intended to serve her at all, and Emily knew the difference. She could feel it in the rhythm of the room, in the way servers moved with precision around every table except hers, in the way conversations dipped just slightly whenever someone noticed she was still sitting there unattended. It was not chaos or oversight. It was a quiet decision repeated over and over again by every person who passed her. And across the room, Jason Miller adjusted his cufflinks as he observed the situation with a measured calm. The kind of calm that came from believing he was in control. He had seen guests like her before, people who wandered into places they could not afford, hoping to blend in long enough to feel important. And in his experience, the solution was simple: ignore them until they left on their own. It kept the atmosphere intact, kept the real clients comfortable, and most importantly, it avoided confrontation. Or at least that was what he told himself. Because the truth was far less professional and far more personal. He enjoyed deciding who mattered and who did not. And tonight, Emily Carter had already been placed firmly in the second category. A server approached Jason quietly, glancing back toward Emily with uncertainty. She has been sitting there for almost 30 minutes. The server whispered. Jason did not even turn his head fully, just a slight shift of his eyes. Then he shook his head once, subtle but firm. She will leave, he replied under his breath. Do not engage. The server hesitated, uncomfortable, but nodded and walked away. And just like that, the silence around Emily became official. Not just an unspoken assumption, but a directive, a rule enforced by authority. And still she did not move. She did not check her phone, did not look around in frustration. She simply sat with a patience that did not match the situation, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly on the table, as if she were waiting for something far more important than a menu. And that was what began to unsettle a few people nearby, because most guests in her position would have left by now, embarrassed or irritated, but she stayed. And there was something about that stillness that did not feel weak. It felt deliberate. And across the room, Jason noticed it too, his brow tightening slightly as he watched her remain exactly where she was, not shrinking, not retreating. And something about that began to bother him in a way he could not immediately explain. Because confidence in a place like this was supposed to look a certain way, it was supposed to be dressed in designer labels and expensive watches. It was supposed to announce itself loudly without ever speaking. But hers was different, quieter, almost invisible, and yet impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He exhaled slowly, straightened his jacket, and made a decision. If she was not going to leave, then he would make it clear that she did not belong. He began walking toward her table, each step measured, each movement calculated to maintain the authority he believed defined him. Conversations softened as he passed, eyes following, sensing something about to unfold. And when he finally reached her, he paused just long enough to let the silence settle, to make sure everyone nearby was paying attention. Then he spoke, his tone polite on the surface, but edged with something colder underneath. Ma'am, he said, drawing the word out just slightly, as if testing it. I am going to need this table for guests who have reservations. Emily looked up at him, her expression unchanged, calm, almost unreadable. I gave my name at the front, she replied quietly. Jason smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the kind that dismissed before it acknowledged. I am sure you did, he said, but this establishment operates at a certain level, and we prioritize guests who understand that. A few nearby diners exchanged glances, some amused, others uncomfortable, and for a moment the room held its breath, waiting to see how she would respond, waiting to see if she would apologize, or leave, or shrink the way he expected. But Emily did none of those things. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that felt almost out of place in that moment. And when she spoke again, her voice was just as steady as before. That is interesting, she said softly, because I was under the impression that this place operated on respect. And for the first time since the night began, Jason hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for something to shift beneath the surface, long enough for the balance in that room to begin tilting in a direction no one had anticipated. Jason's smile returned quickly, but this time it was thinner, tighter, the kind that tried to recover control after something unexpected slipped through. And he let out a short breath as if dismissing her words entirely. Respect, he repeated lightly. as though the concept itself amused him. "This is a fine dining establishment, ma'am, not a casual diner. We maintain standards here. And those standards include understanding how things work." His voice carried just enough to reach the surrounding tables, and a few guests leaned back slightly, sensing the tension sharpening. Emily did not react the way he expected. She did not look embarrassed, did not lower her gaze. Instead, she held eye contact with a calm that felt almost unsettling now, because it did not match the position he believed she was in, and that calm began to shift the atmosphere in a way no one could quite explain. One of the servers nearby slowed down, pretending to adjust a tray just to stay close enough to hear. Another guest set down his fork quietly. Watching, the room was no longer just dining. It was observing, and Jason felt that shift. He felt the attention, and it pushed him further into the role he had already chosen. If she would not leave quietly, then he would make sure she had no reason to stay. "I am going to ask you one last time," he said, his tone firmer now. "If you do not have a confirmed reservation, I will need you to vacate the table." Emily's fingers moved slightly, not nervously, but deliberately, as she reached into her bag. The movement was slow, unhurried, and for a brief second Jason assumed she was searching for a phone, perhaps preparing to argue or call someone, something he was fully prepared to shut down. But instead she pulled out a small leather card holder, simple, unbranded, nothing flashy, and placed it gently on the table between them. The motion was so subtle that at first it did not seem significant, but the moment it touched the table, something shifted, not in her, but in the people around her. The server closest to them froze, her eyes locking onto the card holder as if she recognized something. A flicker of confusion crossing her face, and then something else, something closer to realization. Jason noticed it too, and his brow tightened slightly. He glanced down at the card holder, then back at Emily, his confidence still intact but no longer effortless. "What is this?" he asked, a hint of impatience slipping into his voice. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened the card holder with a small, precise motion and turned it just enough for him to see what was inside. It was not cash, not a credit card, not anything that fit the narrative he had already built in his mind. It was a sleek black access card, the kind used internally, the kind that did not belong to guests at all. Jason's eyes lingered on it for a second too long, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. The server stepped closer now, her voice barely above a whisper as she leaned toward him. "Sir, that looks like..." She stopped herself, unsure whether to finish the sentence, unsure whether she was even right. Jason straightened slightly, dismissing her with a subtle gesture, but the certainty he carried moments ago had begun to fracture, because there was something about the way Emily sat, the way she had not rushed, had not defended herself, had not reacted to anything he said, that no longer aligned with the assumption that she did not belong. And assumptions, once cracked, had a way of unraveling quickly. Still, he forced a small laugh, shaking his head as if the situation had become mildly ridiculous. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," he said, trying to regain control of the moment, "you can take that up with the front desk. But right now, this table is not available to you." Emily finally spoke again, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. "I am not misunderstanding anything," she said, quietly, and then she lifted her eyes to meet his fully, not confrontational, not aggressive, just certain, and in that certainty there was something that made the room feel smaller, quieter, as if everything was narrowing toward a single point that no one could look away from. And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You might want to check your system before you ask me to leave." Jason did not respond immediately, because for the first time that night, he was no longer entirely sure what would happen next, and the silence that followed was no longer under his control. Jason held her gaze for a moment longer than he intended, then let out a controlled breath, as if deciding not to take her seriously. But the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed something else beneath the surface, something unsettled, something he could not immediately name. And without another word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate, composed, but no longer effortless. He stepped slightly aside, turning just enough to shield the screen from the surrounding eyes, yet not far enough to escape the weight of the room that had now fully shifted into quiet observation. A few diners had stopped eating altogether, forks resting midair, Conversations reduced to whispers. The atmosphere no longer about fine dining, but about something unfolding, something none of them wanted to miss. Jason tapped quickly, pulling up the internal reservation system, his expression still confident, still convinced that whatever she implied would dissolve under verification, because systems did not lie. Systems confirmed order, hierarchy, control, everything he relied on to maintain his authority in that space. But as the screen loaded, his eyes moved faster, scanning, searching, and then for the briefest second, they stopped, just a fraction too long. The kind of pause that would have gone unnoticed if not for the tension already hanging in the air. He blinked once, then again, scrolling back as if to double-check what he had just seen, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly, the certainty that had defined him minutes ago beginning to fracture under the quiet pressure of something unexpected. Behind him, the server who had spoken earlier leaned slightly forward, unable to hide her curiosity now, her eyes flickering between Jason's face and the phone in his hand, waiting, trying to read what he was seeing without being told. Jason swallowed subtly, then straightened, lowering the phone just enough to regain his composure. But the delay had already said more than any words could. He turned back toward Emily, and for the first time that night, there was no immediate response, no quick dismissal, no rehearsed authority, just a moment of silence that stretched longer than it should have. The room felt it, that shift, that hesitation, because confidence was loud. It moved quickly, it filled space, but doubt was quiet, and it lingered. And right now, doubt had entered the room. Emily remained exactly as she had been, still, composed, her eyes steady, not watching him with triumph, not pressing for a reaction, simply waiting, as if she already knew what he had found, as if the outcome had never been in question. Jason finally spoke, but his voice had changed, only slightly, but enough for those paying attention to notice. There must be some kind of error, he said, more to himself than to her, as if saying it aloud might make it true. He glanced back at the screen, scrolling again, his movements quicker now, less controlled, searching for confirmation of his own narrative, something that would restore the balance he had been so sure of. But the more he looked, the less certain he became, and that uncertainty began to ripple outward. The server took another step closer, her voice cautious, almost hesitant. "Is everything all right, sir?" Jason did not answer immediately, and that silence spoke volumes. Because managers in places like this were trained to have answers, to respond instantly, to maintain the illusion of perfection at all times. But right now, that illusion was cracking, slowly, visibly, and everyone within earshot could feel it. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, a small movement, subtle, but it carried a quiet shift in power, no longer the one being assessed, no longer the one being judged. She had said very little, done almost nothing, and yet the entire room had begun to reorient itself around her presence. Jason looked up from his phone again, meeting her eyes, and this time there was no dismissal in his expression, only a question he had not yet formed into words. And Emily spoke before he could, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I told you," she said, "you might want to check your system." And in that moment, the truth was no longer approaching, it had arrived, and the room, once filled with quiet superiority, now held its breath, waiting for the moment it would be spoken out loud. Jason's grip tightened slightly around his phone as the reality on the screen refused to change no matter how many times he refreshed it. The name was there, clear, undeniable, not buried, not hidden, but sitting at the very top of the internal system where only a few names ever appeared. Emily Carter, owner access, full permissions, priority override. And for a brief second his mind tried to reject it, tried to rewrite it into something that made sense within the version of the world he had been operating in just minutes ago. But the system did not adjust to his assumptions. It simply reflected the truth, and the truth did not care how he felt about it. Behind him, the quiet tension in the room deepened. People were no longer pretending not to watch. Forks rested on plates, glasses paused midair, conversations had completely dissolved into silence. Because something had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Jason slowly lowered the phone, his movements no longer sharp or controlled but measured, cautious. as if any sudden motion might expose just how much the situation had slipped beyond him. He looked at Emily again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the surface details he had judged before, but at the way she carried herself, the steadiness, the absence of urgency, the quiet confidence that had been there from the beginning. And suddenly it made sense in a way that felt almost humiliating, not for her, but for him. The pieces aligned all at once, the patience, the silence, the certainty. It had never been uncertainty on her part. It had been certainty all along, and he had mistaken it for weakness. The server beside him leaned in again, her voice barely audible. "Sir, is everything all right?" Jason did not answer immediately, because the truth, once acknowledged, required something he had not prepared for, accountability, and that was not something he could deliver with the same ease as dismissal. Emily remained seated, her hands still resting lightly on the table, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not angry, simply present, as if she had allowed this moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Jason cleared his throat, the sound slightly dry, betraying the shift in his composure. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he began, but the words felt hollow even as he said them, because they did not capture what had actually happened. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a choice, a series of choices made based on assumptions he had never questioned. And everyone in the room could feel that difference. Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "A misunderstanding," she repeated softly, the words not confrontational, but not accepting either, just enough to let the truth hang in the space between them. Jason glanced around briefly, noticing for the first time how many eyes were on them, how many people had witnessed everything from the beginning, the ignored entrance, the long wait, the public dismissal, and now this, the reversal, the realization, the quiet collapse of authority. And in that awareness, something shifted inside him, not enough to undo what had happened, but enough to recognize it for what it was. He exhaled slowly, lowering his voice. "Miss Carter," he said, the name coming out carefully now, respectfully, a complete contrast to moments before. "I was not aware." Emily interrupted him gently, not with force, but with precision. "That is exactly the problem," she said, her voice calm but carrying through the silence. "You were very aware, just not of the right things." The words landed quietly, but their weight was unmistakable. Jason did not respond, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct. The truth had already been spoken, and it did not require volume to be heard. Across the room, the head chef had stepped out from the kitchen, his expression tense, his eyes moving quickly between Jason and Emily as the situation became clear to him as well. A ripple of movement followed, staff adjusting their posture, their attention, the entire room recalibrating in real time. But the moment had already passed the point where simple correction could fix it. Emily slowly stood from her seat, the movement unhurried, controlled, and as she did, the subtle shift in perspective became undeniable. The woman who had been ignored was now the center of the room, not because she demanded it, but because the truth had placed her there. She looked at Jason one last time, her expression steady, not harsh, not forgiving, simply honest. And in that honesty, there was something far more powerful than anger, something that left no room for excuses, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of realization, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that stays long after the moment ends. The moment Emily stood, the entire room seemed to shift with her, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that everyone could feel, as if an invisible line had been redrawn, and everyone suddenly understood which side they were on. The head chef approached quickly now, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something far more urgent, his eyes fixed on Emily with unmistakable recognition. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice respectful, careful, and the difference in tone from everything that had come before did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. "I was not informed you would be visiting tonight." Emily turned slightly toward him, acknowledging his presence with a small nod, her expression still calm, still measured. "I did not plan to," she replied quietly. "I just wanted to see how things were running." The words landed softly, but their meaning spread quickly, because this had not been a scheduled inspection, not a formal visit. This had been something far more revealing, something unfiltered, and that realization moved through the staff like a current, subtle but undeniable. Jason remained where he was, his posture rigid now, no longer the one directing the room, but the one being observed, the one being evaluated, and that shift was not lost on him. The chef glanced toward Jason briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, one that did not need words to communicate what had already been understood. Emily stepped forward slightly, her presence now commanding attention without effort, not because she raised her voice or demanded anything, but because the truth of who she was had already done that for her. She looked around the room, taking in the faces, the tables, the atmosphere that had once excluded her and now seemed to revolve around her. And when she spoke again, her voice carried clearly, not loud, but steady enough to reach every corner of the space. This place was built on the idea that everyone who walks through those doors deserves the same experience, she said, not luxury, not exclusivity, but respect. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to ignore. Jason lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of the moment settling fully now, not just as a mistake, but as something deeper, something that reflected a pattern he had never questioned until now. Emily turned back to him, her eyes steady, not harsh, not forgiving, simply direct. "I am not upset that I was not recognized," she continued, her tone even. "I am concerned that I was treated exactly the way you would treat someone you believed did not matter." The words were not an accusation, they were an observation, and that made them far more difficult to deflect. Jason opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but no words came, because there was nothing to explain that would not sound like an excuse, nothing to say that would undo what had already happened, and the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was necessary, the kind that forces reflection, that leaves no room to hide behind routine or policy. The chef straightened beside them, his attention fully on Emily, awaiting direction, awaiting whatever decision she would make next, because in that moment it was clear to everyone that the outcome was hers to define. Emily glanced down at the table she had been sitting at, the untouched setting, the empty glass, the absence that had started it all, and then she looked back up, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes had shifted, something resolved, something final. She reached for the black card still resting on the table, closing the holder with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet room. And then she spoke one last time, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a weight that settled over everyone present. "Fix this," she said. Simply, not the service, not the system, but the way people are seen the moment they walk in, because that is where everything begins. And for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The room held in that stillness as her words settled, not as a command, but as a standard. And as Emily turned toward the exit, walking past the same tables, the same staff, the same space that had ignored her just an hour before, there was no applause, no reaction, only silence, the kind that follows when something important has just been understood. And for the first time that night, every single person in that room was paying attention. The glass doors closed softly behind Emily, and for a moment no one inside the restaurant moved, as if the air itself had been held in place by her presence and had not yet been released. The silence lingered longer than it should have, stretching across tables, across staff, across the entire room that had just witnessed something it could not easily forget. And then slowly, almost cautiously, the world began to move again. A fork touched a plate, a glass was set down, a quiet breath was released, but nothing returned to the way it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, not in the decor, not in the menu, but in the awareness of everyone present. The chef turned toward Jason first, his expression no longer neutral, no longer distant, but firm in a way that carried weight without needing to raise his voice. "What happened?" he asked, not loudly, but directly. And Jason felt the question settle on him heavier than anything Emily had said, because this was no longer about a moment. It was about responsibility. He hesitated, just briefly, but long enough for the hesitation itself to answer part of the question. "I made a judgment," he said finally, the words measured, stripped of excuses, and the simplicity of the statement made it more honest than anything he could have offered before. The chef held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and around them the staff stood quieter now, more attentive. As if every action carried new meaning, a server approached the table Emily had left behind. Her movements careful, almost respectful, as she cleared the untouched glass and reset the place setting. But even that simple act felt different, not routine, but reflective, as if she understood now that what had happened there mattered beyond a single missed service. Jason exhaled slowly, looking around the room, seeing it not as he had before, not as a system to manage or a hierarchy to enforce, but as a space where every decision, every glance, every assumption created an experience that either aligned with what Emily had said or completely contradicted it. And for the first time, he saw how easily it had slipped into the latter, how quickly perception had replaced principle. He stepped back slightly, adjusting his jacket, not out of habit this time, but out of awareness, as if trying to reset something internal that had been exposed. The chef turned toward the rest of the staff, his voice steady, clear. From this point forward, he said, every guest is greeted, every guest is served, no exceptions, no assumptions. The instruction was simple, but it carried a weight that felt different now, because it was no longer just policy, it was accountability, and the staff nodded, not out of routine compliance, but with a new understanding of why it mattered. Across the room, a couple who had been watching quietly exchanged a glance, not speaking, but clearly affected, because what they had seen was not just a mistake, it was a mirror, a reflection of something larger, something that extended beyond this restaurant into every place where people were judged before they were known. Jason turned toward the entrance, his eyes lingering on the doors Emily had walked through, now closed, now quiet, but no longer just an exit. They felt like a threshold, a line between what had been and what needed to change, and though she was gone, her presence remained in a way that could not be dismissed, not by him, not by anyone who had been there. He straightened once more, this time not to assert authority, but to carry it differently, to rebuild it on something more solid than assumption. And as the restaurant slowly returned to motion, the atmosphere carried a subtle but undeniable shift, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, more intentional, because the lesson had not been forced, it had been revealed, and that made it impossible to ignore. And somewhere beyond those doors, Emily continued on with her night, unchanged, unaffected in the way that mattered most, because she had not come to prove who she was, she had come to see what they were, and now they knew that too. The night did not end when Emily walked out. It lingered, stretching beyond the walls of the restaurant and settling into the quiet corners of everyone who had been there, especially Jason, who remained standing near the center of the room longer than necessary, his eyes no longer scanning for problems to fix, but replaying the one he had created, the one he could not simply correct with a gesture or a command, because it was not about service, it was about judgment, and that kind of mistake did not disappear when the moment passed. It stayed, it reshaped the way things were seen. The chef returned to the kitchen, but his presence carried a new edge, sharper, more aware, every instruction he gave now rooted in something deeper than routine, and the staff responded differently too, not just moving faster, but moving with intention, greeting guests with a level of attention that felt genuine rather than practiced. A server approached a newly seated couple at the door with a warmth that had not been there earlier, her smile not forced but conscious, aware that every interaction now mattered in a way it had not before. And across the room Jason finally moved, not toward a table, not toward a task, but toward the host's stand, the place where it had all begun. He paused there, looking at the screen where names appeared and disappeared throughout the night, reservations, times, statuses, all organized, all controlled, and yet none of it had prevented what had happened, because the system had not been the problem, he had, and that realization settled in with a weight that felt different from embarrassment. It felt necessary. He turned to the host, his voice quieter than usual. Make sure every guest is acknowledged immediately, he said, even if we are full, even if they are early, even if we think they do not belong. The last part lingered slightly, not as an instruction, but as a correction. The host nodded, more serious now, understanding that this was not just about service flow, it was about something that could not be measured in reservations or revenue. And as the night continued, the rhythm of the restaurant changed in subtle ways. Conversations resumed, plates were served, glasses were refilled, but beneath it all there was a heightened awareness, a Collective understanding that the experience being created was not just about food or atmosphere. It was about how people were made to feel from the moment they walked in. And that understanding carried through every action, every glance, every decision. Hours later, as the last guests began to leave and the lights dimmed slightly, Jason stood alone for a moment near the same table Emily had chosen earlier that evening. Now perfectly set again, untouched, ready for the next guest who would never know what had happened there. But he would, and that was enough. He reached out and adjusted the glass slightly, a small movement, but deliberate, as if aligning something that had been off, not on the table, but within himself. And in that quiet moment, the lesson settled fully, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a steady shift, the kind that changes how someone operates long after the moment has passed. Because respect was not something that could be added later, it was something that had to be present from the beginning. And that night had made that impossible to ignore. And somewhere in the city, far from the restaurant and the silence she had left behind, Emily continued her evening without hesitation, without reflection on what had occurred, because for her, it had never been about proving anything. It had been about revealing something. And now that it had been revealed, what happened next was no longer in her hands. It belonged to those who had witnessed it, those who had felt it, those who now had to decide whether they would remember it the next time someone walked through those doors. By the time the restaurant closed that night, the silence that had once filled the room had transformed into something else entirely, something quieter but far more enduring, a kind of awareness that lingered in every corner, in every polished surface, in every place where decisions were made without a second thought. And Jason felt it more than anyone, not as pressure from others, but as a steady presence within himself that refused to fade. He moved through the final routines of the evening with a different pace, no longer rushing, no longer assuming, but observing, noticing details he had overlooked before, the way a guest hesitated at the entrance, the way a server's tone shifted depending on who they believed they were speaking to, the subtle signals that had once guided his judgments now revealed as flaws rather than strengths. And as the staff finished their closing tasks, there was less chatter than usual, not out of discomfort, but out of reflection, each person carrying a piece of what they had witnessed, each understanding that what had happened was not an isolated moment, but a pattern interrupted, a habit exposed. The chef gathered them briefly before they left, his voice calm but firm. Tonight was not about one mistake, he said. It was about what that mistake showed us, and no one needed further explanation, because they had all seen it unfold in real time. The ignored presence, the quiet dismissal, the assumption made without question, and the reversal that followed. And in that understanding there was no defensiveness, only acknowledgement, because the truth had been undeniable. Jason stood slightly apart, listening, not as a manager, but as someone who had been forced to see himself clearly for the first time in a long while. And that clarity did not feel comfortable, but it felt necessary. When the staff began to leave, he remained behind, turning off lights one by one, each switch dimming more than just the room, until only a soft glow remained near the entrance, the same place where Emily had first been seen and dismissed. He paused there, his hand resting lightly against the counter, looking out through the glass doors into the quiet street beyond, the city moving on as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside these walls. And for a moment he allowed himself to stand in that stillness, not to dwell on the mistake, but to understand it, because what had happened was not about her identity, not about her position or ownership. It was about how easily respect had been withheld based on nothing more than appearance. And that realization did not come with a dramatic resolution. It came with a quiet decision, one that would not be announced, not written in policy, but carried in every action moving forward. The next morning, when the doors opened again and the first guest stepped inside, there was no sign of what had happened the night before, no trace in the decor, no mention in conversation. But there was something different in the way they were greeted, a pause, a moment of genuine acknowledgement, a choice made consciously rather than automatically. And that choice, repeated over time, would define what the restaurant truly was, far more than any menu or design ever could. And somewhere beyond that moment, beyond that place, Emily's presence had already faded into the rhythm of her own life, unchanged, unburdened, because she had not needed recognition to validate who she was. She had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself, and in doing so, she left behind something far more lasting than any confrontation. She left a standard, quiet but unmistakable, and from that day forward, every person who walked through those doors carried a different kind of weight, not expectation, not judgment, but the possibility of being seen, and that, more than anything else, was what the night